avatara varishtaya Ramakrishnaya te namaha. What happens to us after we die? This is an age-old question which all of the world's religions ask, and they try to give answers to the question. In the Hindu tradition, our ancient scriptures give a very clear answer. In the Katha Upanishad, there's a famous story that involves a boy named Nachiketa, a young boy. Nachiketa and the god of death named Yama. And Nachiketa asks Yama exactly this question. Nachiketa asks Yama, some people say that after we leave the physical body, that consciousness ceases. And other people say that consciousness persists. It continues even after the death of the physical body. So what is the truth? And Yama first tries to tempt him with all sorts of worldly pleasures and says, don't ask such a question. That's a very serious question. It's a very important question. It's too big for the likes of you. And Nachiketa was not one to be tempted by these things, and he refused, and he said, I don't care for any of these things. I want the answer to this question because I know it's the deepest question of life. And Yama finally gives him the answer. And he says, Na jayate mriyate va kadachin vipaschin nayam kutaschin na bhubhuva kaschit ajo nityaha shashvatoyam purano na hanyate hanyamane sharire. So what Yama tells him is, the Atman, the soul, is neither born nor does it die. It is birthless, eternal, undecaying, and ancient. It is not harmed even when the body is killed or even when the body perishes. So Yama gives a very emphatic answer. He says, yes, consciousness does persist. Even after the fall of the physical body, we continue because we are in our essence eternal souls. Then later in the Upanishad, Yama further specifies his answer. He says that there are three possible trajectories for the soul after the death of the physical body, depending on what that person has done in this life, depending on that person's karma. So the first possibility is rebirth, that after you leave this physical body, eventually you'll have to come back to this earth, assume another physical body, and again try to work toward the goal of liberation until you've attained liberation. So in the Katha Upanishad 2.2.7, Yama says this. He says, Yonimanye prapadyante shariratvaya dehinaha sthanumanye nusanyanti yatha karma yatha shrutam. Which means after death, some are born again to assume new physical bodies, while others are reborn as motionless things like trees, according to their karma in this life. So this one mantra has a number of very important doctrines, which are essential to understanding Hinduism. Number one is the doctrine of karma. And number two is the doctrine of rebirth. So the idea is that depending on what we do in this life, whether good or bad, that determines what happens to us in the next birth. And that's for souls who have not attained liberation. Now, there are two other possibilities for souls who have attained liberation in this life. The first possibility is explained by Yama in a different mantra in the same Upanishad, Katha Upanishad, in 2.1.15. Yama says, Yathodakam shuddhe shuddham asiktam tadrig eva bhavati evam muned vijanata atma bhavati Gautama. O Gautama, as pure water poured on pure water becomes just the same, just so the person who has attained knowledge of the self becomes the self. So Yama here uses a very beautiful metaphor to explain how a jnani, a Brahma jnani, attains liberation and what the state of that liberation is for the jnani. He says that it's as if you pour water into another source of water. The water just blends into the water, right? So there's no difference between the jiva and Brahman. Jiva becomes one with non-dual Brahman. This is the idea. So this is one form of salvation. And in other Upanishads, for instance, there are similar statements. So for instance, one of the famous ones in Mundak Upanishad, 3.2.9, is Brahma Veda Brahmeva Bhavati. The person who attains knowledge of Brahman becomes Brahman, right? So it's the same idea. You merge your individuality in the non-dual Brahman. This is the goal for Brahma Jnanis. But at the same time, the same Upanishad, the same Katha Upanishad, teaches that there's a different goal for bhaktas. So in 1.3.9, Yama says, Sodhvanav param apnoti tad vishnov paramam padam. The realized soul reaches the end of the road, and that is the highest abode of Vishnu. So here there's a clear idea in the language that's used that there is an abode, there's a loka. And sometimes the same Upanishad and other Upanishads use the term Brahma Loka very clearly, which means there's this higher loka called Brahma Loka, where liberated souls can dwell for an eternity with the personal God, with Vishnu or whatever you want to call the personal God. Now, that's the Upanishads. So that's the Upanishadic view. And notice that in the Upanishads, there's no question of one form of salvation being higher than the other. The Upanishads don't say that the Advaitic ideal of merging your individuality in the impersonal, non-dual Brahman is somehow higher than the bhakta's goal of dwelling in a higher loka with the personal God. It just says these are two possibilities, depending on your preference, depending on whether you lean toward bhakti or whether you lean toward jnana. Similarly, the Bhagavad Gita makes very similar statements. It gives very similar teachings. So Bhagavan Krishna, in chapter 2, he very clearly teaches about rebirth in a very famous verse, 2.22. He says, Vasamsi jinani yatha vihaya navani garannati naroparani tatha sharirani vihaya jinan anyani sanyati navani dehi. So just as at the end of a long day, we remove our worn out clothes, and the next day we put on new clothes, just so at the end of a lifetime, we get rid of our physical body, and then we take on new bodies. So this is the doctrine of rebirth. And in chapter 9, verse 21, Krishna also says, if you do a lot of good karma, punya karma, in this life, you go to a temporary svarga, a temporary heaven, but eventually you have to come back to be reborn again. So he says, Tetam svargalokam vishalam shine punye martya lokam vishanti. So after you exhaust your good karma in this temporary heaven, you eventually have to come back, and again you have to work and do sadhana until you finally attain the highest goal of salvation. Also, like the Upanishads, Bhagavan Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita, he also teaches that for Brahmagyanis, for Gyanis, people who lean toward the path of Jnana, the ideal is becoming one with Brahman. And the expression that's used constantly in the Gita is Brahma Bhutaha. You become Brahma Bhuta, which means literally you become Brahman. You become one with Brahman. At the same time, so you'll find that expression used in chapter 18, for instance, of the Gita. At the same time, Bhagavan Krishna also fully accepts and embraces the Bhakta's ideal of dwelling in a higher loka with Bhagavan Krishna himself. So he uses the Bhakta's language in places like where he says, Nivasishyasi Mayeva, you will dwell in me. And he says, you will enter into me. Mam evaishyasi, you will enter into me. So all of this language implies that there remains some kind of difference, some kind of distinction between the jiva, the eternal soul, even in the state of liberation, and the personal God. So you find in the case of the Upanishads and in the case of the Bhagavad Gita, they all teach that so long as we have not attained the knowledge of Brahman, we have to be reborn again and again. We have to come back and take new physical bodies. In the birth, when we attain liberation, there are two possible trajectories, depending on our preference. If we lean toward bhakti, we can attain the goal of dwelling in eternal loving communion with the personal God in a higher loka. And if we lean toward jnana, advaita, then we attain the goal of merging our individuality in the impersonal, non-dual Brahman. And the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita, they don't make any kind of hierarchy. They don't say one form of salvation is higher than the other. Now, what happens? A few centuries after the Bhagavad Gita, different schools of Vedanta emerge. And they take more sectarian positions on this issue of what happens to us after death. So, Shankaracharya, who was the great philosopher of Advaita Vedanta, he taught that the highest goal, the ultimate salvation, is becoming one with Brahman. And he claims that the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita and the Brahma Sutras support only his Advaitic view. So he says this bhakta's goal of dwelling in a higher loka, that cannot be the highest salvation. It's a temporary state. Eventually you have to attain this Advaitic state of becoming one with Brahman. But there are also bhakti schools of Vedanta. So Ramanuja's Vishtadvaita, Madhva's Dvaita Vedanta, Nimbarkar's Bheda Bheda Vedanta, these are all bhakti schools of Vedanta. And what they teach is, they say that, no, we reject this idea of Advaitic dissolution, this idea of merging your individuality with Brahman. They say that this is not even true. This does not happen to anybody. It's false. It's a false teaching. The highest salvation and the only form of salvation is dwelling in Vishnu Loka with Vishnu as his servant, as in a loving relationship. This is what some of these bhakti schools of Vedanta say. And then there's a third position, which is adopted by Chaitanya's school of Achintya Bheda Bheda Vedanta and Vallabha's school of Shuddha Dvaita Vedanta. What they say, this is a very interesting position, they accept both ideals. They accept the Advaitic ideal and they accept the Bhakta's ideal, but they have a hierarchy. They say that Advaitins who really want to merge their individuality Brahman, they attain what's called Brahma Sayujya Mukti, which is more or less merging in Brahman. But what they say is that's a very, very inferior kind of salvation. It's not the highest form of salvation. The highest form of salvation is dwelling in Goloka for an eternity as the servant of Bhagavan Krishna, the personal God. They say that's a much more blissful state of salvation, and that the Advaitins are therefore missing out because they don't attain the Bhakta's goal. So these are some of the different sectarian views of salvation that emerged. And all of them are claiming that, no, we teach the correct interpretation of the Vedantic scriptures, of the Upanishads, of the Bhagavad Gita, of the Brahma Sutra. And there's a lot of infighting among the different Vedantic schools. This is where Sri Ramakrishna comes in. He was a great avatara of the 19th century. And I think one of the main reasons why he came as an avatara, this is what Swami Vivekananda often emphasized, one of the main reasons is to bring us back to the original non-sectarian and broad and liberal spirit of the Vedantic scriptures, of the Upanishads, of the Bhagavad Gita. So Swami Vivekananda says this, he says, no one can truly understand the Vedas and Vedanta unless one studies them in the light of the utterance of Sri Ramakrishna. He says it very clearly. So I want to explain, I want to apply Swamiji's statement about Sri Ramakrishna to the context of salvation. According to Sri Ramakrishna, if you study the gospel very carefully, the Kathamrita, you'll find again and again, he says that the Bhakta's goal of dwelling in a higher loka with the personal God and the Advaitin's goal of merging your individuality in non-dual Brahman, both are equally valuable, both are equally great, but it's just a matter of preference. Do you lean toward bhakti or do you lean toward jnana? And he puts this in a very nice way. He says, Bhaktas do not want to become sugar, they want to eat sugar. This is the simple way he puts it. And clearly, just as the sugar metaphor explains, the idea is that it's a matter of preference. He makes it absolutely clear that this is his position in one episode in the gospel. When Mohima Chakraborty, who leans toward Advaita, he asks Sri Ramakrishna this question very directly. He says, I have a question to ask, sir. A bhakta needs Advaitic nirvana sometime or other, doesn't he? And Sri Ramakrishna gives a very interesting answer. He says, it cannot be said that bhaktas need Advaitic nirvana. There is a state in which the eternal Krishna, Nitya Krishna, is with his eternal bhaktas. Krishna is spirit embodied and his abode also is spirit embodied. In Bangla it's Chinmoy Sham, Chinmoy Dham. Chinmaya Shama, Chinmaya Dhama. Krishna is eternal and the bhaktas also are eternal. In Bangla he says, Nitto Krishna, Nitto Bhakta. So he says that for bhaktas the ideal is very different from Advaita. The idea is that the bhaktas want to remain in an eternal, loving relationship with Bhagavan Krishna or some other form of the personal God. So bhaktas will get that, and they don't have to then go on and attain some Advaitic state of nirvana. In another place, he gives a different metaphor. He says, he used the analogy of an ocean, and he says this. He says, Satchit Ananda is like an infinite ocean. Intense cold freezes the water into ice, which floats on the ocean in blocks of various forms. Likewise, through the cooling influence of bhakti, one sees forms of God in the ocean of the Absolute. These forms are meant for the bhaktas, the lovers of God. But when the sun of knowledge rises, the Jnana Surya, the ice melts. It becomes the same water it was before. Now, if he stopped here, you might think that this supports Advaita Vedanta, because he's saying that for bhaktas, these forms of ice, these represent the personal God, forms of the personal God. They only remain so long as the sun of knowledge does not arise. But once the sun of knowledge comes, these ice forms melt, and what's left is non-dual Brahman. But Sri Ramakrishna goes on. So he goes on to say, but you may say that for certain bhaktas, God assumes eternal forms. The Bangla here is Nitya Shakar, Nitya Sakara. This is very important. There are places in the ocean where the ice does not melt at all. It assumes the form of quartz. So Sri Ramakrishna says, in certain places in the ocean, these ice forms remain ice and they become quartz, which means even the sun of knowledge, the sun of jnana, does not melt those forms of the personal God. This is another very clear place where Sri Ramakrishna says that the ideal of bhaktas and the ideal of jnanis are equally valuable and equally great. And I wanted to end with a teaching of Holy Mothers. So one of Holy Mother's disciples, Umesh Babu, he once asks her a very similar question, similar to the one that Mohima Chakraborty asked Sri Ramakrishna. So he says, I'll first read it in Bangla. He says, Oneke to nirban mukti chai na, tader ki hobe? So the translation would be, he asks Holy Mother, he says, many bhaktas, they don't want this Advaitic nirvana. They don't want that type of liberation. What happens to them? And she gives a beautiful answer. She says, Shonanai nitto Krishna nitto bhakto, she bhabe tara thakbe. Tomader bhoy ki, tomader jonne Thakur Ramakrishna lok toiri korechen. So she says, haven't you heard of this idea of nitya Krishna, nitya bhakta? That there are nitya bhaktas and nitya Krishna? This is exactly what Sri Ramakrishna taught. So she's reminding him of Sri Ramakrishna's teaching. She says, you will, as bhaktas, you will remain in this Ramakrishna loka. She says to her bhakta, she says, Sri Ramakrishna has created Ramakrishna loka for you, for bhaktas. So you don't have to worry about having to give up this Ramakrishna loka or melting into the non-dual Brahman. For you, you can dwell with Ramakrishna for an eternity. So on that note, let us pray to the Holy Trio for their blessings so that we may grow in love and broadness and Catholicity and attain God realization in this very life. Whether that God realization takes the form of eating sugar for bhaktas or becoming sugar for jnanis. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.